Lunch at Audiobooks. Marcus Wellington III suggested Audiobooks for our monthly lunch meeting because he read in some financial blog that it's where serious players conduct business over Korean molecular gastronomy that costs $800 per person before wine pairings. The reservation required a 2-month wait and connections through his family's private banking relationships, but Marcus enjoys demonstrating his access to exclusive experiences that money alone can't buy. We're joined by Blake Richardson, who sold his crypto exchange for $400 million last year and now spends his time angel investing in startups that claim to be disrupting traditional industries through blockchain technology. Blake represents everything I respect about our generation. He understood early that the entire financial system was built on artificial scarcity and government manipulation, so he created alternative systems that bypass traditional gatekeepers while generating massive profits for people smart enough to participate. The restaurant looks like a laboratory designed by someone who thinks food should be an intellectual experience rather than just nutrition delivery. Each course arrives on custom ceramics that probably cost more than most people's rent. The servers explain the molecular gastronomy techniques and ingredient sourcing stories like they're presenting doctoral dissertations in chemistry and agriculture. Everything is designed to justify charging obscene amounts of money for tiny portions of deconstructed Korean comfort food. The female hiring initiatives are completely destroying productivity metrics across the entire division, Marcus says, cutting into some kind of fermented vegetable sphere that releases aromatic vapors when pierced. We hired 6 diversity candidates this quarter and none of them are performing at acceptable levels. Marcus works in private equity where performance metrics are ruthlessly objective and mathematical. Revenue generation, cost reduction, portfolio optimization. There's no ambiguity about results. Either you create value or you don't. Either you generate returns or you don't. The diversity hiring mandates force him to prioritize demographic characteristics over competency metrics, which creates inefficiencies that reduce overall firm performance. It's the same everywhere, Blake says, photographing his course before taking a bite. My old firm had to implement unconscious bias training and inclusive leadership workshops. 12 hours of mandatory sessions about how successful white men need to examine our privilege and create safe spaces for marginalized voices. Unconscious bias training. Like successful people need to be educated about psychological biases by HR consultants who've never managed profit and loss responsibility or made decisions that affect shareholders' returns. The entire premise assumes that traditional hiring and promotion practices are based on prejudice rather than objective performance evaluations and competency assessments. What's your take on the whole situation? Marcus asks me, apparently expecting some kind of intellectual analysis of contemporary workplace dynamics and their impact on organizational effectiveness. The situation is exactly what anyone with basic understanding of human psychology and market dynamics would predict. When you prioritize demographic characteristics over competency metrics, you get employees who can't perform at required levels but can't be terminated without triggering discrimination lawsuits. When you implement policies based on ideological assumptions rather than empirical evidence, you create systemic inefficiencies that reduce competitive advantage and long-term sustainability. It's unsustainable from a business perspective, I tell them. Organizations that prioritize ideology over results will eventually be displaced by competitors who optimize for actual performance metrics. Exactly, Blake agrees. But the regulatory environment makes it impossible to operate based on pure meritocracy. You have to demonstrate compliance with diversity initiatives or face legal challenges and social media campaigns that can destroy your reputation overnight. This is the reality of business in 2025. Actual competency and performance matter less than maintaining the appearance of social consciousness and demographic representation. Companies spend millions on diversity consultants and inclusion programs while their productivity metrics decline and their competitive positioning deteriorates. But questioning these policies publicly results in immediate cancellation and professional destruction. The fucked up thing is that it's actually harmful to the people it's supposed to help, Marcus continues. When you hire someone based on demographic characteristics instead of qualifications, Everyone assumes they're a diversity hire who can't perform at the same level as traditional candidates. Plus, it creates resentment among high-performing employees who see less qualified colleagues getting promoted based on identity categories rather than results, Blake adds. I've seen entire teams lose motivation when they realize that advancement depends more on checking demographic boxes than generating revenue or reducing costs. The psychological dynamics are completely predictable. High-performing employees become cynical when they observe that organizational rewards are distributed based on political considerations rather than objective contributions. Low-performing diversity hires become defensive and hostile when they suspect that colleagues question their competency. The entire system creates workplace dysfunction that reduces overall organizational effectiveness. Have you read any of the research on cognitive differences between demographic groups? Blake asks, lowering his voice slightly because discussing this topic publicly can result in immediate career termination and social ostracism. I've read everything. The IQ research, the personality studies, the cognitive ability assessments. The data is overwhelmingly clear that different demographic groups exhibit significantly different distributions of traits that correlate with professional performance in complex cognitive tasks. But acknowledging this research publicly is considered hate speech by people who prefer ideological comfort to empirical accuracy. Some of it, I say carefully, because even private discussions about demographic differences in cognitive ability can be weaponized by people looking for evidence of thought crime and political incorrectness. The military has the most comprehensive data because they've been testing cognitive ability and personality traits for decades, Blake continues. Their research shows exactly what you'd expect based on standardized testing and academic performance metrics. But they can't publish most of their findings because it would contradict official diversity policies. Military research represents the most rigorous analysis of human cognitive differences because military effectiveness depends on accurate assessment of individual capabilities and optimal task assignment. Unlike civilian organizations that prioritize social harmony over operational efficiency, military organizations need precise understanding of who can perform which functions under stress conditions. What's interesting is how the tech companies are handling this, Marcus says. They can't explicitly acknowledge cognitive differences, but they're developing increasingly sophisticated screening processes that effectively filter for the traits they actually need while maintaining plausible deniability about demographic impact. Tech companies understand that product development and market competition require employees with specific cognitive capabilities and personality characteristics. They need people who can handle abstract problem-solving, mathematical reasoning, and sustained focus on complex technical challenges. They've learned to design hiring processes that select for these traits without explicitly mentioning the demographic patterns in their distribution. The coding interviews and algorithm challenges essentially function as IQ tests, Blake explains. They correlate almost perfectly with traditional cognitive ability assessments, but they're job-relevant enough to avoid legal challenges from civil rights organizations. This represents the evolution of meritocratic selection in environments where explicit meritocracy is politically prohibited. Organizations develop proxy measures that correlate with desired traits while avoiding direct measurement of characteristics that might reveal uncomfortable demographic patterns. It's more expensive and less efficient than traditional testing, but it achieves similar results while maintaining legal and social acceptability. The really crazy thing is watching how this plays out in dating, Marcus says, apparently deciding to expand our discussion beyond workplace dynamics to broader social implications of contemporary gender relations. Dating represents the purest expression of actual human preferences because romantic and sexual selection operate according to biological imperatives that can't be regulated by diversity policies or social justice mandates. Women consistently select for traits that indicate genetic quality, resource acquisition ability, and social dominance regardless of their stated political beliefs about gender equality and social justice. Online dating data completely contradicts everything feminists claim about female preferences, Blake says. Women overwhelmingly select for height, income, physical attractiveness, and social status. The top 10% of men get matched with 80% of women, while the bottom 50% of men get essentially no matches. The mathematics of modern dating reveal the fundamental dishonesty of contemporary gender politics. Women claim to value emotional intelligence, communication skills, and feminist consciousness, but their actual selection behavior demonstrates preference for traditional masculine traits that correlate with genetic fitness and resource provision capability. The acts provide quantitative data that exposes the gap between stated preferences and revealed preferences. Plus, you can see how the cultural messaging completely contradicts biological reality, Marcus continues. They tell men to be sensitive and emotionally available and respectful of women's boundaries, but the guys who follow that advice get zero sexual attention while the aggressive assholes get more matches than they can handle. This represents one of the most obvious contradictions in contemporary social dynamics. The same cultural institutions that promote sensitivity and emotional availability as desirable masculine traits consistently reward men who exhibit traditional dominance behaviors and sexual aggression. Women punish compliance with feminist relationship advice while rewarding exactly the behaviors that feminist theory identifies as toxic and problematic. I think social media has just made female hypergamy more visible and efficient, I say, because the data clearly shows that dating apps amplify women's natural tendency to compete for access to the highest status males while ignoring the majority of men who can't offer superior genetic or resource advantages. Exactly, Blake agrees. Before dating apps, most people ended up with partners from their immediate social environment who had similar socioeconomic backgrounds and attractiveness levels. Now women can access unlimited options and they consistently choose the most genetically and financially superior men available regardless of relationship compatibility or long-term sustainability. The efficiency of modern sexual selection has eliminated the traditional constraints that encouraged stable pair bonding and family formation. Women no longer need to settle for local options or consider practical factors like shared values and long-term compatibility. They can optimize purely for genetic quality and resource acquisition, which creates a winner-take-all dynamic that leaves the majority of men unable to secure stable romantic relationships. What's really fucked is how this affects birth rates, Marcus says. The women who could contribute the most genetically and intellectually to the next generation are spending their fertile years pursuing careers and casual relationships with high-status men who have no intention of committing to long-term partnerships. This represents the most serious long-term consequence of contemporary sexual selection patterns. High IQ, educated women delay reproduction while pursuing professional achievement and sexual relationships with men who have abundant options and no incentive for exclusive commitment. Meanwhile, lower IQ women continue reproducing at higher rates, which creates dysgenic selection pressure that reduces average cognitive ability in subsequent generations. And the men who would make the best fathers and providers can't compete in the contemporary sexual marketplace, Blake adds. So you get intelligent, responsible men who remain childless while aggressive psychopaths reproduce with multiple partners and abandon their offspring. The current sexual selection environment actively selects against traits that contribute to civilizational advancement and social stability. Conscientiousness, delayed gratification, and investment in long-term relationships become disadvantageous in a marketplace that rewards immediate sexual gratification and resource extraction from multiple partners. This creates evolutionary pressure toward shorter time preferences and more exploitative relationship strategies. Plus, the whole system is subsidized by government policies that socialize the costs of female sexual choices while privatizing the benefits, I point out. Single mothers receive welfare support, housing assistance, and child care subsidies while the men who would actually invest in raising children get their resources confiscated through taxation to fund these programs. Modern welfare systems represent a massive wealth transfer from productive men to women who make poor reproductive choices and the children who result from those choices. This eliminates the natural consequences of sexual selection decisions while penalizing the men who exhibit traits that traditionally supported stable family formation and child development. It's basically a reverse eugenics program, Marcus says. Government policies actively subsidize reproduction among the least capable demographic groups while penalizing the most capable groups through taxation and regulatory burdens that make family formation economically difficult. The next course arrives and we pause our conversation while the server explains the fermentation process and ingredient sourcing story. Everything about this restaurant represents the kind of unnecessary complexity and artificial scarcity that characterizes elite consumer culture in 2025. Taking simple ingredients and transforming them through elaborate technical processes that justify charging enormous amounts of money for fundamentally ordinary food. Have you guys read any of the IQ research on demographic patterns? Blake asks, apparently deciding to push our conversation into even more politically dangerous territory. I've read all of it. Arthur Jensen, Richard Lynn, Charles Murray, Linda Gottfriedson. The research is overwhelming and consistent across multiple decades and methodologies. Different demographic groups exhibit significantly different average IQ scores that correlate with educational achievement, income levels, crime rates, and virtually every other measure of social success. But acknowledging this research publicly results in immediate professional destruction and social exile. Some of it, I say carefully. It's obviously a sensitive topic. The sensitivity is the whole problem, Marcus says. We can't have honest discussions about demographic differences in cognitive ability, so we end up with policies based on false assumptions about the causes of group disparities in outcomes. This represents the fundamental dishonesty of contemporary social policy. Achievement gaps between demographic groups are attributed to discrimination and systemic bias rather than differences in average cognitive ability and behavioral traits. This leads to interventions that can't possibly succeed because they're based on incorrect assumptions about causation. The achievement gaps exist in every country and every historical period, Blake explains. It doesn't matter what kind of educational system or social policies you implement. The rank ordering of different groups remains completely consistent across different environments and time periods. International comparisons provide the most compelling evidence for genetic rather than environmental explanations of group differences in cognitive ability. The same demographic patterns appear in countries with completely different histories, political systems, and social policies. This suggests that observed differences reflect biological rather than cultural factors. Plus, you can see how the system actively punishes people for noticing obvious patterns, I point out. Academic researchers lose their positions for publishing data that contradicts diversity ideology. Corporate executives get fired for suggesting that hiring practices should prioritize competency over demographic representation. The enforcement mechanisms for ideological conformity in contemporary institutions are more sophisticated and effective than traditional censorship systems. Rather than prohibiting specific ideas through legal restrictions, the system punishes people who express prohibited thoughts through economic sanctions and social ostracism. This creates stronger incentives for self-censorship than direct government control. It's like living in a civilization where you're not allowed to acknowledge basic mathematical principles, Marcus says. Everyone knows that 2 + 2 = 4, but if you say it out loud you lose your job and get excluded from polite society. The crazy thing is that the policies based on false assumptions actually make everything worse, Blake adds. When you try to eliminate achievement gaps through social interventions that ignore cognitive differences, you end up creating more resentment and conflict between different groups. Diversity policies create precisely the kind of intergroup tensions and racial consciousness that civil rights legislation was supposed to eliminate. When people observe that demographic quotas result in less qualified employees and students being selected over more qualified candidates, they develop negative attitudes toward the groups that benefit from these policies. This increases rather than decreases racial awareness and group-based thinking. And meanwhile, the people implementing these policies live in completely segregated environments where they never have to deal with the consequences, I point out. They send their kids to private schools and live in neighborhoods that are 95% white and Asian. Elite progressives consistently demonstrate through their personal choices that they understand the realities they refuse to acknowledge publicly. They pay enormous amounts of money to avoid the demographic diversity they claim to value. They use their wealth and social connections to access educational and professional opportunities that protect their children from the consequences of the policies they impose on everyone else. The final course arrives with an elaborate presentation about traditional Korean dessert techniques adapted through modern culinary innovation. The server explains the symbolism of each component and the cultural significance of the flavor combinations. Everything is designed to justify the enormous cost through appeals to sophistication and cultural appreciation rather than simple nutritional value. What's really depressing is how this affects dating for guys like us, Marcus says, returning to the topic of sexual selection dynamics. Even when you're successful and financially secure, you're competing against dating app algorithms that give unlimited access to the top 1% of men. Contemporary sexual selection creates a tournament dynamic where even highly successful men face intense competition from men with superior genetic traits or higher status positions. Traditional advantages like stable income, emotional maturity, and commitment to long-term relationships become less valuable when women can access unlimited options through digital platforms. Plus, modern women have completely unrealistic expectations because they've been told they deserve the best of everything without offering equivalent value in return, Blake adds. They want men who are tall, rich, physically attractive, and emotionally available, but they bring nothing to the relationship except sexual access and constant demands for validation. The sexual revolution eliminated traditional constraints on female behavior while maintaining traditional expectations for male performance and resource provision. Women expect men to provide financial security, emotional support, and exclusive commitment while offering only temporary sexual access and the constant threat of relationship termination for failure to meet increasingly demanding standards. The marriage rates tell the whole story, I say. Educated, successful men are increasingly choosing to remain single rather than accept the terms that modern women demand for long-term relationships. Marriage has become a fundamentally disadvantageous arrangement for high-value men because divorce laws and cultural expectations create massive downside risk with minimal upside benefits. Men lose access to their children, half their assets, and future earnings through alimony payments, while women face essentially no consequences for relationship termination regardless of the reasons. Which means the next generation is going to be even more dysfunctional because the most capable men aren't reproducing while the least capable women are having multiple children with different fathers, Marcus points out. We're witnessing the collapse of traditional family formation among the demographic groups that built and maintained advanced civilization. High IQ, conscientious men are choosing individual prosperity over family obligations, while high IQ women are choosing career advancement over reproduction during their fertile years. This creates evolutionary selection pressure toward lower intelligence and higher time preference in subsequent generations. The check arrives and Marcus insists on paying because the lunch was his suggestion and he enjoys demonstrating his financial resources through conspicuous consumption at exclusive restaurants. $800 per person for molecular gastronomy that provided less actual nutrition than a $20 meal at any ordinary restaurant. But the cost isn't about nutrition, it's about access to exclusive experiences that reinforce social hierarchy and group membership. Walking back to our respective offices, we continue discussing the implications of demographic differences in cognitive ability and their impact on contemporary social policies. These conversations are only possible in private settings with people who share similar educational backgrounds and professional positions. Expressing these ideas publicly would result in immediate career destruction and social exile. But the ideas themselves are obviously true to anyone with basic statistical literacy and willingness to examine empirical evidence rather than accepting ideological assumptions. The achievement gaps exist. The cognitive differences are real. The genetic explanations are better supported by data than environmental explanations. The social policies based on false assumptions are making everything worse. And yet acknowledging these realities is considered the most serious form of moral transgression in contemporary society. More serious than actual violence or theft or fraud. The entire institutional structure of education, media, and government is organized around maintaining ideological conformity regarding topics where the empirical evidence contradicts official narratives. This creates a civilization where intelligent people must choose between intellectual honesty and social acceptance. Where professional success requires active participation in collective delusions. where obvious truths become unspeakable heresies that can destroy careers and relationships. It's unsustainable. Eventually, reality reasserts itself regardless of ideological preferences. But the transition period involves enormous social conflict and institutional collapse as the gap between official narratives and observable reality becomes impossible to maintain. We're living through that transition period right now. And people like us are the only ones honest enough to see what's actually happening.